While central banks in the United States and Europe are hiking interest rates in an effort to tame inflation, in Brazil, the monetary authority has actually cut the benchmark interest rate by a half percentage point, bringing it down to 13.25%. This week in the Brazilian report, we're going to explain why the Brazilian central bank did that, what is coming ahead, and what can we expect from the Brazilian economy. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Brazil This Week. So today we have, for the first time in our YouTube lives, Diogo Rodriguez, who is not a stranger to the Brazilian Report. He was actually working with us in 2017, 2018, and is now back. Diogo, welcome back, and welcome for the first time to our YouTube lives.
Thank you, Gustavo. It's very nice to be back.
So, Diogo, before we get down to business, I just want to ask our viewers to subscribe to the Brazilian Report, because that's the journalistic engine that fuel our videos, our every piece of content that we do. Actually, what you see on YouTube, on social media, is just a fraction of all the work we do. So you can go to brazilian.report/subscribe and actually access the entirety of our content. We have exclusive reports every day and original takes on what you need to know in Brazil and Latin America. You can go to we have multiple subscription tiers, and one of them is going to fit your needs and your budget. So go to brazilian.report/subscribe, and if you have already subscribed to our content, you can go the extra mile and actually make a donation and pay us a cup of coffee. You can do that on a one-off basis, or actually on a monthly basis. And in the latter case, that will give you access to exclusive content, such as newsletters about Brazilian culture, and also a behind-the-scenes look into how we do our journalism. And I think a big part of the trust crisis that the media is facing is because people don't know how we do what we do, and we actually try to be as transparent as possible with our supporters. So you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, or simply flash that QR code that you have on the bottom right side of your screen. Now, Diogo, let's go get into our subject for this week, which was the Brazilian Central Bank's latest policy decision, which was not surprising, but was a little surprising at the same time. Can you tell us what happened on Wednesday, and how did the markets react to it?
Well, this was there was a lot of expectation on this, but the central bank announced that the interest rates in Brazil were going to be cut by 0.5%, 0.5, and that was unexpected because the markets were waiting for a 0.25% cut rate, and that indicates that the central bank sees the efforts that the current government is doing, and also the general economic situation of Brazil as favorable. It sees that inflation is starting to get under control. It's not under control yet, but it's starting to get under control. And if things remain the same as they are right now, it foresees the possibility of cutting more and more until the next 2 years. So that's one of the things that the statement said yesterday, that they foresee a possibility of cutting 0.5% and then the next meetings that they're going to have this year and the next few years.
And by the way, when we talk about this half percentage point cut, it seems like the central bank is really slashing the interest rate, but actually it says also that it's going to keep the rate in a contractionary mode. So if we can, our production team could please put our graphic showing just how high Brazil's policy rate is compared to other countries. It is on par with Colombia's right now at 13.25%. So what you see is that for 3 years, when the rate was put down to an all-time low 2% to the begin to 2021, when we were seeing inflationary pressures from all over the place, um, we hadn't seen a policy rate cut. For people who are not necessarily that familiarized with how monetary policy works, actually hiking benchmark interest is a way of making borrowing costs more expensive and cooling off the economy in an effort to tame inflation. Um, Now, Diogo, because of inflationary pressures, we have seen this massive monetary tightening process that we just saw in the graph. The fact that, like you said, inflation is better, the economy is functioning, not really outperforming expectations. What's the state of inflation? Because it's interesting that at the same time that the central bank is citing a inflation cool-off, we had a very expressive first quarter GDP growth, and sometimes growth is associated with inflation, but not necessarily this time around. If we can have also the chart about the inflation that can illustrate while Diogo is talking.
Well, as I said before, the central bank noted that even though inflation is somewhat under control, it still sees some risks, especially from global pressures to inflation in Brazil. So, for instance, it noted that the service sector is still facing a high inflation rate, even though the rest of the rest of the basket of services is the best the rest of the basket of what's considered an inflation rate is going down, is facing even in some cases deflation as it's with food. It still sees some problems, and it still notes that we have to keep inflation of services under control, and the global economic pressures can be important in this process. So it's still very cautious. It's not too optimistic as some people might have said in the government today, as we've seen, some declarations by Fernando Haddad and other politicians. But still a positive outcome. And even and inflation in Brazil is within the target band, but still on the high end of that target band. It's not within the ideal inflation rate, as they would call it. So we still have lots of room to improve.
Right, and like you said, the war against inflation is far from won. We had just can we have it back, that graphic, because we had we have two lines: the official inflation in pink, and actually core inflation, which excludes the more volatile prices, and it is a key measurement to show whether inflation trends are structural or just the byproduct of, for instance, energy prices, which are very much volatile. If OPEC, for instance, decides to cut down oil production, we can have a spike in oil prices, etc. So we're seeing that it is a structural trend that cool off in prices. Diogo, like markets were anticipating, and you said, okay, they were anticipating a smaller cut, but that was not the only reason for surprise, right? Because we had a split decision in the Monetary Policy Committee, 5-4 vote for that aggressive 0.5 cut. And actually, the tie-breaking vote was Central Bank Chairman Roberto Campos Neto, and he has been quite hawkish. He is an orthodox economist, and he has, for years, prefer to err on the side of caution. Um, what does that move tell us? Because he has been facing a lot of political pressure for to put to cut down the inflation rate, the interest rate. Um, is that him caving to the pressure?
Well, it's anyone's guess what goes on inside his head. We don't know. But I guess we can say that even though it can be seen as caving into pressure, we still, well, one thing we still need to see what the minutes of this meeting will say. That's going to happen next week on the 8th of August. And we're going to see how the central bank justifies this cut. But the fact that Roberto Campos Neto has voted for a more aggressive cut tells us that maybe well, it signals that the central bank is considering, is starting uh, uh, what is called here in Brazil, the tightening is ending, like the policy to keep interest rates higher is ending, and it seems to be in line with what the statement of yesterday said, that they are going to cut have more consistent cuts in the next few months. So even though Roberto Campos Neto voted for a more aggressive cut, the choice was between a 0.25% cut and a 0.50% cut. Interest rates are still very high in Brazil, so it's not you can't really say that he's changed his position.
Right. And we also have to notice one thing is that the markets have also their own dynamic, right? So the benchmark interest rates does not necessarily mean that, for instance, government bonds are going to necessarily get down because of the interest cut. It will also depend on how markets perceive the credibility of the Brazilian debt. And in that sense, we have seen some positive signs as well, right? We had at least a couple of the big ratings agencies either upgrading Brazilian rating or changing their outlook to a more positive outlook, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we saw Fitch upgrade Brazil's rating this week, and and the perspective is that the Brazilian economy is at least gonna stop diving at least. Today, I don't know if you saw this, but The Economist published a piece, one cautiously wondering if Brazil is taking off again, making a reference to that famous and infamous cover that they had a few years ago when Lula was in power, and Brazil was seen as a relevant actor in the international economic scenario, and in a country that was ready to grow, ready to make itself relevant in the economic scenario. And The Economist is cautiously optimistic, making some compliments to Fernando Haddad, the economy minister. Now it's the finance minister of Brazil. The name changed, and maybe we're seeing a comeback of Brazil internationally, even though more cautiously than a decade ago. But still, I think people are starting to get a little bit more optimistic. The markets in Brazil and outside of Brazil.
Right, and we're going to keep covering what's going to happen with Brazil's monetary policy, also with the Brazilian economy. Diogo especially is going to keep a close eye on that. Next week, we have the minutes of the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee's meeting, and we're going to know in more detail the rationale behind that 0.5 cut, and you can follow that on the Brazilian Report. Our website is brazilian.report. Diogo, thanks for being here, and I hope to be with you very soon for another edition of Brazil This Week.
Thank you, Gustavo. It was a pleasure. See you next time.
And before we let you go, just another reminder to our viewers, please subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind these videos and actually every piece of content that we do. Brazilian.report/subscribe. If you have already subscribed, you can donate a cup of coffee, and God knows journalists do need them. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, or you can just flash that QR code on the bottom right end of your screen. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I was with Diogo Rodriguez, and see you next time. Ciao.